putting together a conference is nothing compared to the task before me right now, to which I am doomed to failure, which is doing justice to Christine Alexander as a person, a scholar, a teacher, a mentor, and a friend. I can't do that. I can't. But somebody has to have. It's a privilege to fail at such a task, I think. Last night over dinner, Christine used a phrase that might be an aphorism in some circles, but to me was new, and she described what we do in scholarship as turning information into knowledge. And I thought that was I think that's what you said. I'm going to insist that that's what you said. And unless Lori Langbauer said it, because she's very wise too. And I thought that's a really good summation of some of the things that Christine does. She turns questions into strategies. She turns strategies into discoveries. She turns knowledge into insight. Historians often talk about there being two kinds of historians, the truffle hunter and the parachutist. One of the things that makes Christine amazing to me is that she's so good at both, and sometimes it almost seems like she's doing both at once. She's there, just right in there, digging up those wonderful details, which she's been doing, I think, long before that fabled cross-America trip via Greyhound bus with her knapsack on her back, visiting all the archives that had Brontë manuscripts, which led to a career that has transformed Brontë studies. It has transformed, she, with Juliet McMaster, created the scholarly field of literary juvenilia, I would say. She is, as you all know, PhD from Cambridge. She's a member of the FAHA. She's a fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities, Scientia Professor of the School of the Arts and Media at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. She is the general editor of the Juvenilia Press. She has been, for me personally, a very important mentor and someone who writes always brilliantly and always helpfully and clearly on everything from landscape and visual arts and to Jane Austen and Elizabeth Gaskell, and we have a grad student here who is very interested in Gaskell, who is looking forward to talking to you. And I'm starting to ramble and I'm tripping over my own tongue, but if all you can conclude from this is that I am deeply honored to have the opportunity to welcome Christine Alexander to the University of North Alabama and to our conference, Microcosms, then I have succeeded as well as I could have hoped. And Christine, I will turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. That was quite a story, and I appreciate it. I'm not sure how true it is, but never mind. Thank you very much. It was very nice. Well, it's lovely to be here, and wonderful that Jeffrey and Leslie have organised this conference, and some of us have come from further afield than others, but it's great to have everyone here. And I'm looking forward to launching, well, I'm not launching it, but they're going to be launching their Juvenilia Press book during the course of today, which is very exciting. I'm talking, as you can see, on Branwell Brontë. Now, it happens to be the bicentenary of Branwell Bronte's birth this year. And so the aim of this paper is to talk about Juvenilia, of course, but also to celebrate his amazing early creativity, rather than concentrate on his rather tragic later decline. Many of you, most of you, will know about Charlotte Bronte's early writings. Fewer, I suspect, are familiar with those of her brother, Branwell. He's actually Patrick Branwell Brontë, known as Branwell. He was a year younger than her, and her partner in the prolific writing project associated with their imaginary world of Glasstown and Angria. So I'd like to begin with the material objects. Here they are, the famous, those that are extant, handmade booklets in minuscule writing, with tiny illustrations. The open booklet in the centre, let's see if I can do this. Here is Branwell's. You can just make out a picture of a castle there with a flag on it, and down here you can see horses galloping, and there's people fighting these horses, people on horses. It's obviously some sort of battle. So, that is the earliest dated manuscript of the Brontes, the earliest one, written on the 12th of March 1827 when he was only 9 years old. It contains pictures of his toy soldiers, you can see there, enacting actually the Battle of Washington, American battle, and a few sentences describing the event over the page. These, of course, were the wooden toy soldiers from the box of 12 that his father famously gave him for a birthday present and that he shared with his 3 sisters. An act that initiated the young men's play that eventually grew into the saga of Glasstown and Angria. And it's significant that Charlotte's earliest manuscript, seen here on the left, is actually a story, a very personal story about a little girl called Anne, and it was obviously a present for her younger sister Anne. So here we have Charlotte writing about personal things and about her sister, and Branwell writing about battles, his very earliest few words about something. Branwell, of course, he called it Battle Book, that's the title of it, and he continued to be absolutely fascinated with military affairs throughout his writing career. I suppose in many ways it's the stereotype female-male thing with children, but in fact it really did take hold of Branwell, this idea of the military and of battles. The physical object itself is crude. It's a very crude, handmade little booklet, 8 pages, only 5 by 8 centimetres. So we're talking about this size. I mean, really small. It's got a cover of blue paper bag, from a sugar bag, blue paper. Recycled, obviously. Paper was scarce. It was expensive, and the young Brontes practiced recycling, this type of recycling that would make us embarrassed, I think, or certainly put us to shame. All their manuscripts are written on scraps of paper. The other two booklets are by Charlotte here, the 2 little ones at the bottom. They are smaller still, 5 by 3 centimetres, really just a matchbox size. Brown paper covers, minuscule script that imitates newspaper print. These manuscripts were fashioned to match the size of the audience. The audience, of course, were the 12-inch toy soldiers. And the tiny size of the print had the added advantage of rendering the contents of the manuscripts illegible to adult eyes. So it helped to maintain the secrecy of their shared imaginary world. And when I first started working on these little manuscripts, apart from the fact that I did take a Greyhound bus and a pack on my back all around America and literally ferreted out all sorts of unpublished manuscripts that people didn't know about in private collections and in libraries around America. Apart from that, I was working at a time when most people thought I was mad, working on what they called that kids stuff. They thought it was really insignificant, and this was actually a phrase articulated by the professorial head of the person who first employed me. He thought I would never get my work published. In fact, the first book won a British Academy Prize, but it's quite. I wasn't going to tell you that, but in fact, it's quite an interesting story about how you can go for something that you're really interested in and you think's worthwhile, and not take notice of everybody. So that's how it started. Anyway, since then, the value of the Brontë early writings has actually risen exponentially. In terms of current market value, this particular miniature booklet of 20 pages, written by Charlotte at 14, sold for £691,000. It was bought by a French investor just 2 years ago, and it was written, as I say, by Charlotte at 14, and it was twice what we thought the pre-sale estimate would be. I had to assess it for Sotheby's, and I had to take a trip to Paris to transcribe it and for publication. The Brontes would have been, I think, even more astounded than I was at that incredible price. I think it's clear, though, that very different values are operating here from those that I'm going to be speaking about today. The Brontë name, the rarity of the object, and perhaps the fact that Juvenilia are now a bit more valued and respected, seen as significant artefacts equal to letters and adult manuscripts, played a part in this sale. As scholars, we're more, of course, interested in what we might call the intrinsic value of these objects, both the tangible and intangible criteria associated with them. The secrecy implied in their tiny size, the toy soldiers' first audience, the literary models reflected in the booklets, recycled materials used as covers that tell us something about family customs, household customs, the fictional authors and the real authors, the creative practice demonstrated in those booklets, and of course much more, including what we might term their microcosmic value. Now, since microcosm is the theme of the conference, it seems appropriate, as first speaker, to begin by defining the term. The OED gives a number of related definitions, but generally speaking, a microcosm is a place or situation or community regarded as encapsulating in miniature the characteristics or features of something much larger. In Vivian Gray, for example, Benjamin Disraeli talks about the microcosm of the public school, the school representing all the features of the larger community of which it is a part. The word was originally used to refer to human nature and an individual as representing the world or the universe even. Hence, of course, its juxtaposition with macrocosm. And its use also in philosophical theories of the cosmos. G.K. Chesterton voiced this when he said, "Man is the microcosm. Man is the measure of all things." In this talk, I will explore Branwell's microcosmic world, created especially with his sister Charlotte, as representative of the larger world from which, as children, they were excluded. I'm going to try to raise questions that I hope we can consider throughout the conference, questions relating to small things, large ideas, representation, power, gender, identity, and other relevant issues associated with the concept of microcosm. I'll be aligning the term with the more recently coined concept of paracosm, a word, a psychological word, that's increasingly being used in relation to long-term, full-scale imaginary worlds created by children. And these are usually sophisticated alternative realities that have their own history, their own culture, geography, politics, publications, and language. And although they need not reflect the larger world, these paracosms, most of them inevitably do. And in relation to Branwell, I want to suggest that his frenetic literary output is actually a remarkable witness to early artistic talent, to an energetic experimentation with models of the authorial self. But that his paracosmic world also documents the way imaginative excess and misdirected creativity can handicap a promising young author. So, there are two parts to my talk. There they are up the top, Branwell's miniature microcosmic world as macrocosm, and Glass-Turner's microcosm of literary culture in relation to Branwell. Now, Sylvie and McKeith, they were the originators of the term paracosm. In their seminal study, The Paracosm, a Special Form of Fantasy, and they define the paracosm as a spontaneously created but maintained and elaborated imaginary private world. As I understand it, this private world, imaginary one, might or might not be a microcosm. They list 5 types according to the different influences on the children that they interviewed for their experiment, for their examination. McKeith says their imagination didn't work in a vacuum, and hence the reason why I actually think paracosms are also always have features of microcosms. That is, that they reflect the larger community, the world that they come from, because the children have to have something to work with. They don't imagine in total isolation. There are worlds based on technology and the future. Other worlds are centred on places or communities such as schools or churches or theatres, apparently. And there are others that rely on very elaborate systems. They create genealogies or charts, maps, architectural drawings. In fact, this third type here is rather like the Rowley writings, the world of Rowley that Chatterton created with his genealogies, his maps, his architectural drawings. And it's a pity I've got a PhD student, Kate Sumner, who was going to come and speak on Chatterton's drawings. Maybe next time she'll be able to. She's actually in London at the moment, working at the British Library on Chatterton's drawings, but she wasn't able to get the time away from her children to extend it. And then the Brontes. The Brontes' imaginary world draws from this later one, but in fact fits into the last 2 most common types of paracosm, which are these next ones. First of all, worlds based around toys and animals and shared by a very small family group. There are first the physical objects, the toy soldiers, and then as the children mature, the imaginations take over. One of the paracosmists interviewed by Sylvie and McKeith said, "Once we realised we could draw and write about the characters, we were emancipated from the toys." I thought it was this. This is the dramatic Alabama weather. Good. I've got a dramatic background. It was actually the Brontes' experience, because once the toy soldiers were gradually broken or got lost, the children kept everything going through their imaginary representatives, and they continued the saga then of their heroes and authors, and directed by the Brontes themselves, who were of course the creators. And the second common type involves worlds based on islands, on countries and their inhabitants. Joetta Harty, who was at our Barcelona conference, was the first to talk about paracosm in relation to the geography. And I'm trying to persuade her to publish her work on this, because it's very good. She talks about the Brontes type of paracosm being important in terms of geography of the period. Well, significantly, in the case of the Brontes, this type is actually very heavily focused on writing stories and on involving history, romance, and biography. So they document relationships and they create special characters. So that's the one that the Brontes most fit into. When Emily and Anne broke away from their elder siblings' influence, they actually established the world of Gondor, of course, that was based purely on islands, 2 islands in the Pacific Ocean, one in the North Pacific, one in the South. There's not much relating to that, but a lot of their poetry all fits into that. And actually, this particular book that I did is a selection of all the Brontes' Juvenilia. It's a World Classics one. I bought a copy along to show you because this has a really good overview of the whole of the Bronte Juvenilia, and it has all Emily and Anne's poetry that is related to Gondor in it, as well as some of Branwell's. Now, perhaps the most important features of paracosmic play are that they are invented worlds that are private, seldom revealed to those outside the group, and that the worlds are consistent. I've already mentioned the secrecy value of the Brontes' miniature booklets. Neither their aunt, who ran the household after their mother died, nor their father had any idea of the explosively violent and sexual nature of the Brontes' early writing. At Rowhead School, Charlotte was very tempted to tell her best friend, Mary Taylor, about the little booklets, and she told her she was going to tell her, but in fact she thought better of it next day because she saw that her siblings would consider it a betrayal. So secrecy is a big thing with this type of paracosmic world. When, as young adults, the Bronte sisters published their poems relating to their sagas, they altered the names of characters and places in order to disguise the source of the poetry. And when Branwell first published, he in fact was the first of his siblings to publish. Many people don't know that, and his sisters never knew it. He was very careful to mask the Angrian references, although most of his 18 poems published in newspapers was signed Northanglerland, his favourite paracosmic pseudonym. Now, both Charlotte and Branwell ensured the consistency of their imaginary world. When Branwell exuberantly kills off important characters in his manuscripts, Charlotte comes to the rescue and she makes them alive again for the next stories. So you're able to keep going with the whole similar world. And when Branwell becomes bored with his inventions, such as the Glasstown magazine that he edits, Charlotte takes over the initiative and she keeps it going for several more years. It was Branwell, however, who took pride in systematising their private world, in maintaining a consistent political structure through which they could order the world. He documented in encyclopedic detail, in neat lists and footnotes, in sketches and in maps, the geography, the history, the government and the social structure of Glasstown. Here's one of his maps, which I'll talk about later. And he laid down really the parameters of this imaginary world, ready for the drama and the history and the military fiction that he would write and paint about. Here's an early painting of his, and the high life and Gothic romances that Charlotte favoured. From the age of 10, he was interested in architecture, and he transposed versions of London's public buildings, this is the microcosmic value, into Glasstown, later sketching them in the margins of manuscripts, as you can see here. He did this when he was 16 years old. And he gained further inspiration from his art lessons, using copies that he made, like this particular one that he did at the age of 13, a copy of a John Martin painting, Queen Esther, there in Babylon, as models for the grand verdopolitan buildings in Angria and in Glasstown. Glasstown is renamed Verdopolis, by the way, in case you're wondering why I call it Verdopolian. Now, from the beginning, the Brontes were aware that their creation was fictional, and this is also another prerequisite for the paracosm. They have to be aware that this is not real life, that it is fictional. And they acknowledged this by inventing special roles for themselves as authors, as manipulators of supernatural and other unlikely events, narrative events. Realising their godlike powers as creators of Glasstown, they named themselves Chief Genii. with that realising their ultimate authority over everything they did, and their special responsibility too for protecting their particular country and the character that they'd chosen to rule it. Branwell was especially keen on the power that this gave him in the play with mere mortals, his invented characters. And he combined the idea of Greek gods from Mount Olympus, a trope that he'd got from his classics lessons, of course, with his father, with the idea of the genie from the Arabian Nights, and also with representations of God in the Bible. Thus, the chief genie always appear on clouds, amidst thunder and lightning, and of course he was Chief Branny Lightning as well as the chief genius, because as soon as he learnt that Brontë was actually thunder in Greek, so it was quite interesting. He was using all his lessons, everything from his world went into his writing. And the genii appear not only on clouds with lightning, but they have the trumpet-like voice of God from Revelation, and they appear also on splendid ethereal thrones, and mortals, these are the glass town characters, are often struck by this lightning and they fall down blinded as if dead. So all these features come into the creation of the genii, who are the created authors. And like his sisters, unlike his sisters, Branwell made a point of stamping his authority on the Glasstown manuscripts that were written, of course, by Glasstown characters. And you can see there his authority on his letters from an Englishman. You can see that they are by Sergeant Budd, but they are also by Branwell Brontë, and they are published by Branwell Brontë, etc. And he's always signs things. And you can see the little colophons. These are I suppose, a combination of statues of liberty, if you like, but also figures of liberty of the scales, some of them have got, but they're always on clouds, and they are also representative of the genii. The chief genii lend actually perspective to the narrative process and allow the young writers to play with their roles as authors, intervening in events. They can bring themselves into events through the idea of genie, and they allow the young writers to play all the time, disrupting the normal lives, so-called normal lives, of their characters. Written as the saga is from the point of view of the characters, the fictional narrators, in fact, are only vaguely aware of these huge creatures in the background, the Brontes themselves disguised as genii, who read their minds and who control their fate. And you can see that they're able to play with this whole idea of narrative structure and perspective. The genii are formulated as guardians of the land, protectors, and often arbitrary judges. It's a creative device that works very well until Branwell goes AWOL and has to be restrained. He appears to have disliked the idea of protector, preferring to go on the rampage now and then, and uttering, we're told, the horrible howl of his war cry. So Charlotte got sick of this, having various characters destroyed, etc., and she steps in eventually, and she formally expels the genii after about the age of 13, 14, and in her poem, The Trumpet Hath Sounded, and it's modelled on Byron's destruction of Sennacherib, giving a very good example of the rivalry between brother and sister within their collaboration. Now, this awareness of creative power, irrespective of gender, is a new sensation for the motherless children. It's inherent in their very first written records. When we read Charlotte's History of the Year, we sense the excitement and control. I just quote very briefly. Next morning, Branwell came to our door with a box of toy soldiers. Emily and I jumped out of bed, and I snatched one up and exclaimed, "This is the Duke of Wellington. It shall be mine." And when I said this, Emily likewise took one and said it should be hers. These are Branwell's, of course. When Anne came down, she took one also. Branwell chose Bonaparte. Branwell had already actually invented and documented earlier plays with previous sets of toy soldiers. But until Wellington appeared, Charlotte and her sisters had shown very little interest in, his military manoeuvres and his invented lands. And preempting her brother's usual leadership role in this respect, Charlotte composed what she called a romantic tale about the voyages of 12 adventurers or young men, the toy soldiers, who discover the coast of Guinea, and their leader, they actually fight with the Ashanti tribes, they secure some land, and they elect the Duke of Wellington as leader, and then acquire these lands in the west of Africa. Really round about where we have Ghana and Nigeria now. So that's here, and the young men came from England down here through Ascension Isle, where they happened to fight the Dutch and destroy and annihilate them. And then, typical colonial fashion, came around here, and they settled in what was called at the time Fernando Po, which is over here. And this is really the delta of the Niger. And they established their lands. This is Wellington's land, this is Parry's land, this is Ross's land, Steekie's land, which ends up being Scotland. They're all based on England and the British Isles. And this is Ireland. And this is the federal part with the capital Glasstown here. Angria is eventually established over here. This is Frenchy land, the French opposite, and that's where the enemies all come from, of course. And you can see how it's all based on the British Isles. Now, not to be outdone by his sister, and in an effort to reassert control over what, after all, are his soldiers, Branwell writes what he calls a real history. And indeed, it's a marvellous example of early imitation. Here is the title page of The History of the Young Men by Branwell. And what he does is correct his sister's version, laying down the physical and historical content from his point of view. He grandly titles it The History of the Young Men from their first settlement to the present time. And he takes particular care with this title page, as you can see. It's modelled on those of contemporary histories. He talks about the author, John Budd, with all his credentials, Vice President of the Antiquarian Society, Fellow of the Association for the Reward of Learning, Captain of the Regiment of the Hussars, etc., etc. This is typical of what was done in the period, of course. Captain John Budd is an eminent Glasstown political writer and historian, one of Branwell's major pseudonyms in the early writing. And Branwell actually spent several months writing 18 pages of incredibly neat, minuscule printing, laying out his pages like a contemporary history with headings and summaries, and the summaries there in the italics, so to speak, and footnotes at the bottom of the page. It's significant, I think, that as the only son, Branwell seems to have had access to better quality, slightly larger lined paper than his sisters for what he considers to be an important work of literature. The very length of the title and the carefully imitated title page, based on print culture at the time, suggests the businesslike, almost obsessive way in which he contradicts much of Charlotte's fantasy and records instead exact dates, battle manoeuvres, government procedures, and business activity of their imaginary world. Branwell creates his own miniature version, in fact, of the Peninsular Wars with Napoleon and Wellington. And he maps onto his African colony the names and battles associated with the two greatest heroes of the day. In subsequent manuscripts, he continues to reconfigure European colonial aspirations, inventing republican uprisings, inspired, of course, by Napoleon and by demagogues from Frenchy land. Always in opposition to Wellington, and to his son, the Duke of Zamora. And as we've seen in the case of the chief genie, rivalry and the power of the author become central features of the Brontë paracosm, both in relation to creator siblings and amongst the leading heroes and the authors of the saga. And now I'd like to focus on Branwell's role within the Glasstown saga in relation to the microcosm of literary culture. So if we return to the little magazines by Branwell, we can see the precocious child imitating various writers and journalistic practice of the day, announcing and playing out his authorial intentions, ambitions at the age of 11. The magazine was actually Branwell's idea, inspired by the family's favourite, of course, Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine. And he immediately claimed authority as owner and editor in the title. He called it Branwell's Blackwood's magazine. There we have 3 of the early copies. In fact, the only 3 copies extant. 1, 2, 3. The ones that are open. The other ones here shown are the covers of Charlotte's, some of Charlotte's that she took over afterwards. And you can see there very clearly the use of the recycling of paper. Those were pamphlets. I think there's something about John Wesley on one of them here. Oops, sorry. Down here. Just here. Wesley. And you can see the advertisements for books, etc., just recycling the paper. And you can see his very elaborate title page. These are the 3 extant issues, the very earliest manuscripts of the Brontes in the Lowell collection at Harvard, January, June and July 1829. But it's actually clear from internal references that other issues were also produced by him until August that year, when he turned his attention to actually a Glasstown newspaper which he was writing. He didn't last for long on different things. He had ideas all over the place, put them into practice, and then moved on. He handed the editorship of the magazine over to Charlotte, contributing occasionally, but soon complaining of the frivolity and the foolish romances that had replaced his previously sober and grave productions. I've got a poem here for you to give you a taste of his writing, a poem that was written in the November and published in inverted commas, in the November monthly issue of the magazine for 1829. And it expresses the scorn he has at Charlotte's efforts to preserve his superior content and discussion. We might just very quickly look at it. It's in the voice of Sergeant Budd. You can say, I don't know how many of you can read it, all soberness is past and gone. The reign of gravity is done. Frivolity comes in its place. Sorry, I know you're broadcast. Light smiling sits on every face. Gone is that grave and gorgeous light, which every page illumined bright. A flimsy torch glare instead of a bright golden sun now fled. Foolish romances now employ each silly, senseless girl and boy. Oh, for the strong hand of the law to stop it in its powerful claw. This is the voice of the Budd, Sergeant Budd, the lawyer. I'll talk about the rest in a minute. And you might notice that the next verses are very heavily based on Wordsworth's Daffodils here, or I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, his well-known lyric poem. At night I lay my weary head upon my sofa or my bed. In the dark watches of the night does flash upon my inward sight visions of times now passed away, when dullness did the sceptre sway. Then to my troubled mind comes peace. Would those bright dreams did never cease. And I put the Wordsworth verses on the right. You can see how their little young boy, 12 years old, is using his sources. A lot of Branwell's writing is based on Wordsworth and Byron. It's very, very obvious imitations. Actually, what I'm interested in is that, as I say, it's heavily based on Wordsworth's lyric poem and his idea of emotion recollected in tranquility. But the emotion here is dullness. Dullness, of course, derived from Pope's Dunciad, which Branwell knew very well. This is the age of 12. And the lawyer, of course, also, his bright dreams are actually dreams of visions of dullness. And I think there's surely an irony here that suggests that Branwell, although he thinks little of Charlotte's romances, is also in fact laughing at his speaker, and perhaps himself, I think, as the producer of very sort of assiduous scholarly imitations he's aware of what he's doing. He's not stupid. He's a very clever young man. So he's laughing at himself as well, which is I think, quite healthy. And since Charlotte's also the editor of this particular magazine, she's probably had an input into the composition of this. And I suspect that's what the WT is. If we go back at the end, the signature, WT is for we too. And some of them are UT, which is us too. There's a bit of a debate, and I've written about this elsewhere, but I think that here it's definitely Charlotte and Branwell as well. So Charlotte's had something to say here. Now, Branwell's Blackwoods magazines, actually they were all, the three of them are published in our Juvenilia Press volume, so I'll make a little advertisement here for them, if anybody's interested. And they were published for the first time, actually, by the Juvenilia Press. And the Houghton Library very proudly sells it for us, which is great, at Harvard. So they vividly reflect, I think, the contemporary literary scene, and this is the point I want to make in terms of microcosm. Branwell makes every effort to imitate the format, the style, the content, the tone of Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine. The title pages are very crude imitations, set out with elaborate colophons, and you saw that, the publication details, etc. There we have it again. And you'll note that, as I say, he stamps his own name on it. It's Branwell's Blackwood's magazine, and also, in case you've missed it, instead of a picture of William Blackwood, which is always in the centre of the Blackwood's title pages, you've got his own initials, Branwell Brontë. It's actually PB there because it's Patrick Branwell Brontë. Okay. There are in these magazines contents pages and advertisements, just like the original. There are poems, articles on travel, natural history, letters to the editor, prose fiction, literary notices, reviews, and a dramatised dialogue entitled The Nights, modelled on the Noctes Ambrosiana that you find in Blackwood's. The Noctes, in case you're not familiar with it, was an amazing series of vigorous, often libelous, conversations between fictitious and real characters. You had people like Christopher North, etc., who was a fictitious incarnation of Lockwood. You had Byron and De Quincey in their own names. And these conversations were rigorous literary debates on politics and on books, etc. And they inspired, for the Brontes, a model of literature as dynamic interchange. And Branwell apes the style and bravado of this particular series. Experiments with genres, etc., that I've mentioned, playing with a variety of character types as pseudonyms, characters that are responsible for different genres in the Juvenilia. Essentially, he's trying out different literary hats, searching for his authorial voice. And as Victor Neufeld points out, even in his earliest manuscripts, Branwell fully revealed his ambition to become a man of letters and a poet. The sort of man of letters and poet that he encountered in the pages of Blackwood's. So from Blackwood's, Branwell derived a model of literature seen as really interchange and play, rivalry, playful rivalry. Stories about the same event could be told by different characters from different points of view and still have validity. Both Branwell and Charlotte could assume different literary voices, and as Sergeant Budd, Branwell could scorn Charlotte's degenerative editorial policy, whereas as Lord Charles Wellesley, she could satirise Branwell's excessive effusions, which he called poetry. Branwell's poetic persona at this time actually was a character called Young Salt, S-O-U-L-T. He was called Young Salt, the rhymer. He's actually the fictitious son of Wellington's major adversary, well, one of them, in the Napoleonic Wars, a voice which Branwell could espouse, in which Branwell could espouse Republican views, which, rather like his heroes, the early Romantics, of course, don't forget Wordsworth was a Republican to begin with, and then counter his Tory Blackwoods heroes. So Branwell liked to be the rebel. Until the age of 14, Branwell thought of himself, in fact, as chiefly the Glasstown poet Young Salt. He's consciously building an image of himself and his imagined avatars as poet and literary figure. In 1829 alone, his first full year of writing, in addition to his magazines, a newspaper, a 2-volume travel book, he wrote at least 34 poems or verse fragments, including an attempt at Latin verse and a verse drama. And this is all at the age of 14. Remarkable output. And he was also painting, learning the flute, and probably the organ at this time. Other personas also proliferated, with Branwell impersonating not only the prose writer Captain John Budd, but his poet son, Sergeant Budd, who also, in fact, a demonic incarnation of Chief Genius Banny, Branwell, the controlling author, Branwell himself, in the form of an evil little man called Sir Death, who acts as a familiar for Branwell's hero, Alexander Rogue, alias Alexander Percy. Here he is here. He's as a pirate on the right, and when he gets a little more respectable here on the left. Now, it's quite an interesting idea, a demonic authorial incarnation who motivates a favourite character. And it was to prove, I think, rather ominous for Branwell. More of that later. Percy, or Rogue, is actually a revolutionary, a pirate, who by marrying Lady Zenobia Elrington gains a title and is elevated to the Duke of Northumberland. The Duke of Northumberland, modelled on the Duke of Northumberland. Branwell then sets about, in fact, inventing Northumberland's biography. He actually becomes obsessed with this particular character, his rogue Percy Northumberland creation. With his Byronic personality, his political machinations, and his ambiguous relationship to Charlotte's hero, the Duke of Samorna and King of Angria. The mercurial young Salt, the poet, disappears. He adopts other poetic personas and also prose writers who chronicle the entangled fortunes of Northumberland, Glasstown, and the new kingdom for Angria. He writes histories. He writes in turn as Captain John Budd, Captain John Flower, Viscount Richton, Henry Hastings, formerly admired but now a disreputable poet, and Charles Wentworth. All these different personas. And by the age of 18, Branwell is enmeshed, really, in a sprawling history of nearly 300 pages, quarto pages, in minuscule script involving intrigue, murder, and heartbreak, all more or less instigated by Northumberland. Here is one of the many, many pages. This particular group of manuscripts has been bound by a collector, but you can see these quarto pages, almost obsessive. They go on, and trying to sort them out is an absolute minefield. Victor Neufeld did a fabulous job of a lot of it in the early days. I had to read it all before he got hold of it, unfortunately, and I didn't read it all, but enough to try and piece everything together in terms of the saga. The manuscript here is, this is 1835, he's 18. The manuscript here is open at a page. It's a description by Henry Hastings of Montmorency, who is Northumberland's sometime friend and enemy. His oratory, the effect of his oratory on the listener, on the crowds. It happens to be the Angrian elections, and they're very important. And they echo in detail in the rhetoric and the crowd reaction, the interest that Branwell took himself in the 1835 British general election. Branwell himself played a part on the hustings. He actually spoke in this election. And it seems that he's using his various fictional personalities to process his everyday life at this time and his ambitions. And if you're getting confused with the multiple characters that I've mentioned that Branwell impersonates, it's hardly surprising. Charlotte began by laughing and then by worrying about her brother's frenetic activity and divided interests. Her 1834 caricature mocks what she calls his almost insane devotion to all the celebrated characters in Verdopolis and his excessive enthusiasms, especially for music and pugilism. Branwell had developed a very extrovert personality, and he was finding it increasingly hard to control in public. Charlotte brilliantly captures his exaggeration, his boastfulness, and his ambition in her extended portrait of Patrick Benjamin Wiggins, a character originally created by Branwell and another incarnation of himself. Charlotte's Wiggins not only kicks his heels in the air and stands on his head at the sound of the organist playing Handel, Branwell's favourite composer, but also has him composing his tombstone with the following words. As a musician, he was greater than Bach. As a poet, he surpassed Byron. As a painter, Claude Lorraine yielded to him. As a rebel, he snatched the hand from Alexander Rogue, alias, of course, the Republican Northumberland. As a traveller, de Humboldt, Ledyard, Mungo Park never braved half the dangers or overcame half his difficulties. He civilised Australia. He founded the city of Wiganopolis in New Zealand, which is surely Wellington, where Mary Taylor went to. It's all very interesting. This is before Mary ever went to. This is Charlotte's friend, went to New Zealand. And so it goes on. It's an absolutely wonderful catalogue of exaggeration and satire that you can find, actually, in our Juvenilia Press volume of My Angry and the Angrians, which Juliet and some of her students did many years ago. Okay, so this was the time, I'm almost finished, this was the time when Branwell, despite his poetic ambitions, was planning to become a professional portrait painter and hoping to enter the academy schools. In preparation, of course, he painted the now famous, crudely executed portrait of his three sisters, age of 18, together with numerous other paintings and sketches. Now, Branwell's Wiggins, this character, is actually a would-be artist, a self-deprecating one, and this is significant. Although he ominously laughs at his own pretensions to art. In Branwell's Angrian novelette, The Wool is Rising, Wiggins appears as a mere colour grinder to the famous painter Sir Edward de Lisle. Branwell mocks, in fact, also his own red hair, his mat of red hair, and his slight stature, which would look ridiculous in a boxing ring. And pugilism was one of his favourite hobbies at the time. His face, actually, with its large freckled visage he talks about, and its large Roman nose. You can see this is an ordinary portrait that he did of himself, but on the right you have one of his many little caricatures. You can see that's obviously him with his spectacles, and he had no chin at all apparently, so he tried a sort of beard if he could, and he calls himself Augustus Caesar. You know, this is mocking himself as a Roman tyrant, and he was a tyrant in many ways, and a question mark there, you see. it was actually the time too when he was taking refuge in the Black Bull pub. He had an increasing lack of confidence in his artistic ability, despite the praise and encouragement from family and friends. And his inability also to handle everyday life is increasingly reflected in his writing and his pseudonymous characters. He frequented all the time the Black Bull, where an admiring circle of illiterate locals would ply him with drink while he entertained them with brilliant conversation. Anybody who came to town went to the Black Bull, stayed there, and they immediately sent to the parsonage for Branwell Brontë to come down and entertain him. And that's how he got all this liquor. It was rather like the inebriated conversation of the literati in Blackwood's Noctes Ambrosia, so that Branwell was imitating, and whose ranks Branwell really did want to join. It's sort of really quite sad and a bit of an irony. Elsewhere, it was becoming extremely clear that the confidence Branwell's fictional characters showed deserted him in any public situation. And he would either stammer or adopt very inappropriate bravado derived from Northumberland and his cronies to boost his confidence. The line between his public and paracosmic personas was beginning to blur. And he seems to have found it impossible to concentrate on a single purpose: artist, musician, poet, journalist, would-be pugilist, or to wean himself from his Angrian personalities and his increasing identification with Northumberland. Northumberland had been in the making from his earliest incarnation as Rogue, a renegade hero of the early saga, as I said. And the name Rogue suggests, of course, the mischievous, destructive side of Branwell's personality that he recognised right from the beginning, and he loved to play with. He develops as a complex amalgam of Branwell's enthusiasm for Napoleon, for Milton's Satan, which Branwell writes about a lot, and for the dark side of the Byronic hero. Charlotte seems to have always gone for the lighter side of the Byronic hero, the womanizer, whereas Branwell was into very much the dark side. The demagogue, the revolutionary, the politician. Northumberland is first friend and then foe to the Duke of Zamora, whose third wife is actually Northumberland's daughter, Mary. And so in the saga, there's quite a relationship. And he takes central stage in all of Branwell's manuscripts, many of which probe the recesses of Northumberland's duplicitous mind. They seem to often be reflecting Branwell's own conflicted thoughts about atheism and about damnation that are recorded in sketches and in poems. Northumberland's troubled psychology and various alter egos owe much to James Hogg's portrayal of the doppelganger, a concept that absolutely fascinated Branwell in later life. In poetry and prose, he explores Northumberland's atheism, his amorality, his restless energy, and his inability to maintain a loyalty or stable relationship for long. And needless to say, Northumberland has 3 wives and a variety of mistresses, many legitimate and illegitimate children. Now, Northumberland is also a poet, ostensibly responsible for most of Branwell's long philosophical poems that reflect on the meaning of life. As I've mentioned, it was under the pseudonym Northumberland that Branwell made his first attempt at publication in the real world at the age of 18. And he sent his poem entitled Misery to Blackwoods, who failed to answer him. It's hardly surprising, because here are a few sentences he wrote, and this gives you a good idea. Sir, read what I write, and would to heaven you would believe in me, for then you would attend to and act upon it. I know myself so far as to believe in my own originality, and on that ground I demand admittance to your ranks. And do not wonder that I demand so determinedly, for the resemblance I spoke of have fixed you and your magazine in such a manner upon my mind that the idea of striving to aid another periodical is horribly repulsive, underlined. My resolution is to devote my ability to you, and for God's sake, till you see whether or not I can serve you, do not coldly refuse my aid. And so he goes on for pages. The bombastic tone and the swagger that you see here is not the Branwell Brontë lacking in self-esteem, but the created personality Northumberland, whose voice and image he would never have assumed had he met the Blackwood's editors in person. A year later, he wrote to Wordsworth in a similar tone, asking him to pass judgment on another poem because he wished to push into the open world as a poet. He sent the poem The Struggles of the Flesh with Spirit, and you can see it here. Wordsworth was apparently disgusted by Branwell's excessive flattery, and he does overdo it. And he declined to answer. And it's very sad, really, because Branwell needed encouragement. The brilliant assumption of pseudonymous voices that I've tried to talk to you about, that enabled the precocious young writer, was now proving a decided handicap to the aspiring 20-year-old poet. And although Branwell signed many of his final poems with his own name, in his own name, Northumberland was never far away. If we're looking for an explanation for Branwell's eccentric behaviour and increasing inability to distinguish himself from Northumberland, we might turn again briefly to the paracosm. Cohen and McKeith point out that developmental problems associated with the idea of being in a world of one's own can develop from long involvement in the imaginative world. Longevity is actually a prime characteristic of paracosm. And their classic disadvantage is that some children use them as a defensive escape mechanism. More recent psychologists have been inclined to minimise this danger in the features of paracosm, but Cohen has actually labelled it post-traumatic paracosm, a response to long-term repeating trauma. And certainly records suggest that Branwell in particular had been traumatised by the death of his eldest sister, Maria, who had been a little mother to him after the death of his mother when he was a small child. And he wrote many poems about this in his later years. And Branwell's stressful decline into alcoholism and drug addiction is well documented. Whatever the reason, Angria and its disruptive protagonist, Northumberland, seem to have developed into some sort of escape mechanism for Branwell, who found it very hard to cope with ordinary life and the expectations placed on him as the only boy. Although Charlotte managed to wean herself away from their imaginary paracosmic world at the age of 23, Branwell continued to write under its influence, though to a lesser extent, until his death at 31. Here we have all his later manuscripts that were published, and you can see there the signature Northumberland. It's still with him. So by way of conclusion, however, I would actually like to stress that despite this possible pathology that I've just been talking about, the evidence of Branwell's early magazines and histories suggests that his initial motivation was not merely escapist or compensatory. The early writings that I've touched on suggest a playful, agile young mind, stimulated by the stories that he's read, by the classical legends of discovery, of war and politics, and of the world despite his youth. A mind, actually, and this is no small thing, that encouraged, if not inspired, the early writing efforts of his three sisters. And for a child, there is no better way to explore life than to invent a microcosmic world over which he can exert power and explore situations usually beyond his control. And in Branwell's case in particular, Glasstown and Angria allowed him to play the author. This was the important thing. It allowed him to play the author and to explore his literary expectations in life. So, thank you.